My name is Thomas. I'm in my late 30s. I've spent most of my adult life being described with words like steady, reasonable, the calm one. I work in a role that rewards consistency more than visibility, and I've always been comfortable letting louder personalities take up the room. People often mistake that for softness, or worse, compliance. If you met me before all of this happened, you might have thought I was predictable. Married, planning a family, the kind of woman who color codes calendars and remembers appointment numbers without checking her phone. The kind of person doctors speak to last, after they've already addressed the more emotional partner. I didn't correct those assumptions. I rarely do. This isn't a story about rage or public revenge. There are no slam doors, no screaming matches, no viral confrontations. What I'm sharing happened quietly, methodically, and mostly inside my own head, long before anyone else realized the ground had shifted. This story begins at a moment that was supposed to be hopeful. I was packing for an IVF appointment, one we had waited months for, folding clothes with the careful optimism you adopt when science becomes part of your marriage. That was the day I discovered my husband's affair, not through lipstick or hotel receipts, but through something far more ordinary, far more calculated. Her name was saved under the clinic's contact. What follows isn't about how he betrayed me. That part is painfully common. It's about what happens when the person everyone underestimates stops reacting and starts observing. It's about silence that isn't weakness, patience that isn't forgiveness, and power that never announces itself. Over the next chapters, I'll walk you through who I was to the people around me, how small dismissals became a pattern, and how I learned to let others believe I was still the same woman, right up until the moment their assumptions became irreversible mistakes. I'm not telling this to dramatize pain or to collect sympathy. I'm telling it because honesty, when delivered calmly, has a weight that anger never does, and because there are many of us walking around with quiet strength, waiting for permission to trust it. If you've ever been underestimated because you didn't raise your voice, have you ever wondered what people assume you'll never do? I was the dependable one, not the favorite, not the priority, just the one people relied on without thinking twice about it. To my husband, I was the organizer of our life, the keeper of passwords, the one who remembered which forms needed originals and which ones could be uploaded as PDFs. When we talked about our future, he spoke in big, hopeful gestures. When we have kids, when things settle down. I handled the logistics beneath those dreams, quietly translating them into appointments, budgets, timelines. To his family, I was polite and capable. The woman who brought the right dish without asking, who didn't mind clearing plates while conversations drifted past her. They trusted me with practical matters, but never emotional ones. I wasn't asked what I thought. I was asked what time something started. At work, I was known as solid. The word came up often in performance reviews. Solid, reliable, calm under pressure. It meant I was given responsibility without authority, expectations without spotlight. When something went wrong, I was looped in. When something succeeded, my name stayed off the slide deck, and I let that be enough, because for a long time it was enough. I'd learned early that visibility comes at a cost. My mother was loud, expressive, constantly demanding space, and constantly punished for it. I learned another way. Be observant. Be prepared. Let people underestimate the depth of your awareness. There is safety in being overlooked. So when small things happened, interruptions, decisions made without consulting me, jokes that landed a little too close to dismissal, I absorbed them quietly. I told myself it wasn't intentional, that everyone was busy, that I was imagining patterns where none existed. The truth is, invisibility doesn't arrive all at once. It accumulates. It shows up when your opinion is acknowledged last, if at all. When plans are changed without informing you because you'll understand. When your emotional steadiness becomes an excuse for others not to check in. I wasn't mistreated in any obvious way. There were no raised voices, no cruel words. That's what made it harder to name. From the outside, my life looked functional, stable, even privileged. Inside, I was becoming a role instead of a person. The role was simple: Be useful, be calm, don't complicate things. And I played it well. When we began IVF planning, everyone assumed I was handling it effortlessly. The medications, the schedules, the emotional weight. I was praised for being strong about it. No one asked if I wanted to be strong. Strength had simply been assigned to me, the way it always was. What they didn't see was how carefully I listened, how much I noticed. I noticed when my husband stopped asking follow-up questions about appointments, when he deferred details back to me too quickly, when his phone was always face down, not suspiciously, just habitually, enough to register, not enough to accuse. I noticed how easy it was for people to assume I would adjust, that I would accommodate, that I would remain steady, no matter what was placed on my shoulders, and I let them believe that. Because at that point, even I believed it. I thought my value was in how well I could hold things together, how quietly I could absorb disappointment without spilling it onto others. I thought being needed was the same as being respected. That version of me wasn't weak. She was just incomplete. And everyone around me, my husband included, mistook her silence for permanence. The first moment didn't announce itself. There was no sharp pain, no instinct to pull away, just a subtle shift, like realizing a room is colder than you thought, only after you've been sitting in it for a while. It happened during a routine conversation, one of those exchanges so ordinary, it barely qualifies as a memory unless you examine it closely. We were sitting at the kitchen counter, paperwork spread between us, consent forms, insurance confirmations, the quiet bureaucracy of trying to create a child. I was explaining a scheduling change the clinic had made, something minor, but important enough to adjust medication timing. He nodded, barely looked up. Halfway through my sentence, his phone vibrated. He glanced at it, smiled faintly, and then, without apology, stood up and walked into the other room while I was still speaking. Not rushed, not flustered, just gone. I finished the sentence anyway, out of habit, out of reflex. My voice trailed into empty space, and I remember thinking, that was unnecessary. Not cruel, just unnecessary. When he came back, he didn't ask me to repeat myself. Instead, he said, "So they're moving it again?" That was the cut. Small, clean, almost surgical. I answered him. Of course I did. I summarized, clarified, adjusted. I didn't say, "You walked away while I was talking." I didn't say that mattered to me. I told myself he was stressed, distracted, that IVF does strange things to people. And everyone else did the same kind of mental smoothing for him. Later that week, I mentioned it to a friend, not as a complaint, more as an observation. She laughed lightly and said, "You know how men get with medical stuff. At least he trusts you to handle it." Trust. That word closed the conversation. Once a behavior is labeled trust, it stops being examined. After that, similar moments began to appear more often. My suggestions being acknowledged and then overridden. Decisions we made that I learned about after they were already set. Messages relayed through me, not to me. Each one was small enough to dismiss on its own. Together they formed a pattern no one else seemed interested in naming, including me. I told myself I was being sensitive, that my expectations were misaligned, that this was what partnership looked like under pressure. One person leaning more heavily while the other compensates. So I compensated. I became even more efficient, more organized, more emotionally neutral. I made it easier for him to not notice the imbalance, easier for everyone to continue as before. But something in me marked that moment, quietly, permanently, because the issue wasn't that he stepped away. It was that he assumed I would still be there when he returned, ready to resume, to adapt, to fill in the gap without acknowledgement. And he was right, at the time. That's the thing about the first cut. It doesn't bleed. It teaches others where they can touch you without consequence. And once that lesson is learned, it's rarely unlearned without cost. After the first cut, nothing dramatic followed. That's how normalization works. It doesn't escalate loudly. It settles in quietly, like furniture you stop noticing because it's always been there. The moments began to blur together, not identical, just similar enough to feel familiar. Conversations where my input was acknowledged with a nod and then quietly ignored. Plans adjusted without discussion, followed by a casual, "I figured you'd be fine with it." Decisions framed as mutual that I had no memory of agreeing to. None of it malicious, none of it overt. That was the most confusing part. Because how do you object to something that arrives wrapped in politeness? When I paused before answering, he would fill the silence for me. When I disagreed gently, he would reframe it as stress or hormones. IVF became the universal explanation, the invisible eraser. If I seemed distant, it was a lot on you. If I pressed a point, it was this process making everything heavier. And maybe some of that was true, so I stayed quiet. I told myself I was choosing peace, that I didn't want to create conflict where none was intended, that relationships go through phases where one person carries more weight. I told myself I was strong enough to absorb it. The dangerous thing about rationalization is how convincing it sounds when repeated often enough. Friends reinforced it without realizing. You're the grounded one. You're so low drama. He's lucky you're not reactive. Each comment landed like praise, but functioned like instruction. Don't react. Don't ask for more. Don't disrupt the version of you everyone prefers. So I adjusted my expectations instead. I stopped bringing things up unless they were urgent. I softened my language. I shortened explanations. I learned exactly how much of myself could be expressed without triggering impatience. And he learned that I would. There's a moment when disrespect stops feeling like an external force and starts feeling like an environment. You don't brace against it anymore. You adapt your posture. You learn how to move inside it without bumping into sharp edges. That's where I was. Still competent, still functional, still outwardly calm. But something inside me was recording everything. Not emotionally, not angrily, accurately. I began to notice how often my silence solved other people's discomfort. How often my patience allowed things to proceed without adjustment. How rarely anyone checked whether my quiet meant consent or simply exhaustion. I noticed how easy it was for people to rely on my resilience without ever asking what it cost. And I told myself this was temporary, that once the IVF cycle stabilized, once life slowed down, things would rebalance, that I was being practical, not invisible, that I was choosing quiet, not being erased. What I didn't realize then was that silence, once normalized, is no longer interpreted as a choice. It becomes a role, and roles once assigned are very difficult to step out of, especially when everyone benefits from you staying exactly where you are. The realization didn't arrive with anger. It arrived with clarity. I was not misunderstood. I was understood perfectly, just in a way that benefited everyone else. My role had been defined quietly, over time, by what I tolerated without comment. I was the one who would handle things, smooth things over, adjust without needing acknowledgement, the emotional buffer, the logistics spine, the steady presence that allowed others to remain unbothered. Once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. My husband spoke about our life as if it ran on its own, as if systems simply existed, appointments scheduled themselves, deadlines were remembered by some invisible force. Emotional labor dissolved once performed. When something went wrong, he was surprised, not apologetic. Surprised in the way people are when infrastructure fails. Confused, not accountable. At family gatherings, I noticed how questions were phrased. Can you help with this? You're good at these things. We didn't want to bother you. Bother me, as if my entire presence wasn't already a form of service. No one meant harm. That's what made it so efficient. There was no villain to confront, no dramatic moment to point to. Just a slow, collective agreement about who I was allowed to be. Reliable, useful, quiet. And I had signed that agreement without reading the fine print. The most unsettling part was how little resistance there was when I stayed in that role. How smoothly everything continued. How my absence from certain conversations wasn't noticed until something practical was missing. That's when I understood something uncomfortable. My visibility was conditional. I was seen when I performed, invisible when I paused. And the pause was the problem. I started to test it in small ways. Not confrontations, just absences. I didn't remind him about a deadline once. I didn't correct a scheduling mistake that wasn't mine to fix. I waited to see if anyone else would step in. They didn't. Instead, confusion surfaced. Mild frustration. A sense that something had gone off script. Not concern for me. Concern for the system I represented. And in those moments, I saw how deeply embedded my role had become. I wasn't partnered with. I was depended on. And dependency, when unacknowledged, is not intimacy. It's extraction. That realization didn't make me angry. It made me still. Because anger would have required me to demand recognition from people who were comfortable not offering it. Stillness, on the other hand, gave me something far more useful. Time. Time to observe without reacting. Time to understand where my leverage actually was. Time to decide whether I wanted to renegotiate this role or step out of it entirely. I didn't announce any of this. I didn't withdraw affection or make speeches. I simply stopped filling every gap automatically, and what I learned in that space would change everything. The shift didn't happen during an argument. There was no confrontation, no raised voices, no moment anyone else would recognize as pivotal. It happened on an ordinary afternoon, the kind you forget unless something inside you changes shape. I was alone in the apartment, folding laundry with the windows open. The city hummed outside, distant traffic, a neighbor's music bleeding through the walls. My husband wasn't home yet. He'd texted earlier that he was running late, nothing unusual about that. I remember noticing how calm I felt. Not numb, not sad, just neutral. That was new. I wasn't waiting for him. I wasn't rehearsing a conversation in my head. I wasn't bracing myself for another small disappointment. I was simply moving through the motions present in my body in a way I hadn't been for months. And in that quiet, something settled. I realized I no longer felt the urge to explain myself to anyone, not to clarify my intentions, not to soften my expectations, not to preemptively make myself easier to deal with. It was as if a long internal negotiation had ended without a meeting. I sat down on the edge of the bed and let that awareness sit with me. No analysis, no emotional spiral, just a simple truth forming, fully intact. I don't need to be understood in order to act. For so long, I had believed clarity came from conversation, that if I just articulated things carefully enough, gently enough, people would meet me where I was. That harmony required constant translation. But what if it didn't? What if the need to be understood was the very thing keeping me anchored to a role that no longer fit? That thought didn't make me feel powerful. It made me feel free. I understood then that change didn't require an announcement. It required alignment. A quiet, internal decision to stop volunteering for erasure. When my husband came home later that evening, nothing was different on the surface. We talked about dinner, about work, about the upcoming appointment at the clinic. I listened. I nodded. But I was no longer orienting myself around his responses. I was orienting myself around my own. That was the day something shifted. Not in my marriage, not in my circumstances, but in my posture. I stopped waiting for permission to take up space inside my own life. No one noticed. That was the point. Silence feels different when it's no longer forced. Before, my quiet had been reactive, a way to smooth things over, a way to avoid becoming a problem that needed managing. I stayed silent because it was expected, because it kept things moving, because it made other people comfortable. After that day, silence became intentional. I still spoke when necessary. I still answered questions. I still showed up. But I stopped offering myself as the default solution. I stopped anticipating needs that weren't voiced. I stopped translating emotional subtext for people who had never learned to listen. And almost immediately, the misinterpretations began. He thought I was tired. Others thought I was distracted. A few assumed I was finally relaxing and letting go of control. No one considered that I might be choosing restraint. There's a particular kind of power in being underestimated at the moment you become most aware. People project their own explanations onto your silence, and in doing so, they reveal exactly how they see you. I watched carefully. When I didn't remind him of a detail, he assumed it wasn't important. When I didn't step in to manage logistics, he believed someone else would. When nothing happened, he was mildly annoyed, but never reflective, because reflection would have required him to see the structure I had been holding in place. My quiet allowed him to believe nothing had changed, and that belief gave me room. I started keeping notes, not emotionally, not obsessively, but accurately. Dates, times, inconsistencies, small things that didn't add up but didn't demand explanation yet. I didn't search. I didn't confront. I simply noticed. People underestimate how much information lives in the background when you stop filling the foreground with yourself. I also began preparing internally for multiple outcomes, not catastrophizing, planning. What would my life look like if things stayed the same, if they worsened, if I chose to leave, if I chose not to? I didn't need answers yet. I needed options. That's the part no one talks about. Silence isn't empty. When chosen deliberately, it's full of movement, just not the kind others can see. He mistook my calm for compliance. Others mistook it for passivity. I let them, because when people believe you're not paying attention, they stop being careful. And attention, I was learning, was my greatest advantage. Preparation doesn't look like preparation when you're quiet about it. From the outside, my life appeared unchanged. Same routines, same tone of voice, same willingness to be present without demanding the center of attention. I still cooked dinner, still showed up to family events, still asked how his day was. What no one noticed was how intentional my attention had become. I wasn't scanning for proof. I wasn't hunting for betrayal. That implies urgency, emotion, a need to confirm a fear. What I was doing was slower and far more precise. I was mapping reality. I noticed patterns in his schedule that didn't align with what he said. Not dramatically, just small inconsistencies. Meetings that ran late on the same days. Phone calls taken in another room, always framed as work, always brief, always followed by a lightness that hadn't been there before. I noticed how often his phone was silenced now, how he stopped leaving it on the counter when he showered, how notifications never appeared when we were sitting together, but seemed to multiply the moment I left the room. None of that proved anything, but it didn't need to, because proof isn't the first step, understanding is. I began documenting, not obsessively, not emotionally, just enough to preserve clarity. Notes in my planner, written in the same neat handwriting I use for grocery lists and deadlines. Times, dates, phrases that felt rehearsed. I didn't reread them often. I didn't spiral. I trusted myself enough to know that when something matters, you don't forget it. At the same time, I started positioning my life more independently, quietly, methodically. I reviewed our finances, not because I suspected wrongdoing, but because I needed to know what autonomy would look like if I chose it. I updated personal records. I ensured my own accounts were accessible without explanation. I didn't move money. I didn't hide anything. Preparation isn't deception. It's self-respect. I also paid attention to myself, to how my body responded to his presence now, to how my nervous system no longer surged when he entered a room, to how the idea of us felt less like an anchor and more like a question mark. And I didn't rush to answer it. People think strength announces itself with certainty, with declarations, with lines drawn in the sand. But the strongest shifts happen internally, long before they're visible. What they never noticed was that I had stopped centering my life around preserving harmony. I was centering it around truth, even if that truth hadn't fully revealed itself yet. I wasn't angry. I wasn't afraid. I was ready. And readiness, when mistaken for weakness, creates an opening most people don't realize they've given you. The truth didn't arrive with a rush of adrenaline. It arrived quietly, almost respectfully, like it had been waiting for me to be ready. I was packing for our IVF appointment. That detail matters, because it anchors the moment in a kind of hope that hadn't fully left me yet. I was folding clothes carefully, lining up documents, checking off items in my planner. The ritual was familiar, comforting even. Preparation had always been my way of steadying myself. His phone was on the bed. That wasn't unusual. He'd left it there while showering. I wasn't snooping. I wasn't suspicious. I wasn't even thinking about him. I was thinking about injection schedules and timing windows and whether I'd packed the right paperwork. The screen lit up, just briefly, long enough to register. A notification preview, a name. The clinic. At least, that's what it appeared to be. But something about it didn't sit right. Not alarm bells, just dissonance. A quiet, internal pause. The kind you learn to trust when you've stopped rushing yourself out of discomfort. I picked up the phone. No urgency, no shaking hands. Just curiosity grounded in months of observation. The contact name matched the clinic's formatting. Same capitalization, same neutral tone. But when I opened the message thread, the language didn't belong to a medical office. It was familiar, casual, intimate in a way that had nothing to do with treatment plans or appointment confirmations. Her name was saved under the clinic's contact. That was the moment clarity arrived. Not devastation, not disbelief. Alignment. Everything I had noticed, every inconsistency, every quiet adjustment, clicked into place without resistance. There was no need to reread messages obsessively. No need to dig further. The structure was visible now. Clean. Undeniable. I set the phone back down exactly where it had been. I didn't cry. I didn't confront him when he walked out of the bathroom. I finished packing. That's what shocked me the most, not the betrayal, but my own calm. The absence of chaos inside me. I felt grounded, almost relieved, as if uncertainty had been heavier than truth, and now it had been lifted. This wasn't leverage in the dramatic sense. There was no thrill in knowing, no impulse to expose or punish. It was leverage because it gave me choice. I could see the full board now, the pieces, the timelines, the implications. And for the first time, I wasn't reacting to a version of reality shaped by someone else's omissions. I was operating in truth, and once you have that, you don't rush. You decide. Knowing something and acting on it are two very different experiences. For a while, I existed in the space between them. I went to the appointment. I sat in the waiting room with my hands folded in my lap, listening to the soft murmur of other couples speaking in hushed optimism. I answered questions calmly. I nodded at the right moments. From the outside, nothing about me suggested a fracture had just been exposed. Inside, I wasn't unraveling. I was assessing. Truth has a way of slowing time. Every option becomes visible at once, and none of them demand urgency. That surprised me. I had always assumed discovery would come with an explosion of feeling. Anger, grief, the kind of pain that makes decisions for you. Instead, I felt something closer to gravity. I could confront him immediately. That path was clear. It would lead to explanations, partial truths, emotional bargaining, promises shaped by fear rather than integrity. I knew that terrain well enough to predict how it would unfold. I could walk away without explanation, disappear quietly, protect myself, preserve dignity. That option held appeal, but it also required me to move without full alignment, without preparation completed. Or I could wait, not to punish, not to manipulate, but to ensure that when I moved, I would never have to move again. I thought about what I wanted, not in the abstract, but concretely. Safety, autonomy, a future that didn't require me to shrink in order to function. I thought about the child we were trying to create and the environment that kind of truth would grow up in, and I understood something with absolute certainty. I would not build a future on a foundation that required my silence to survive. That realization narrowed the options quickly. Waiting wasn't avoidance, it was alignment. I chose the path that preserved my clarity, the one that allowed me to act without chaos, without pleading, without needing to convince anyone of my worth or my reality. I didn't owe him immediacy, I owed myself precision. So I continued as I was, present, observant, composed. I didn't change my tone, I didn't alter my routines, I didn't give him any reason to become cautious. People think decisions announce themselves internally with certainty and relief. Sometimes they do. Other times they arrive as a quiet refusal to go back to not knowing who you are. Once that refusal settles in, there's no urgency left, only direction. Movement doesn't always look like motion. Sometimes it looks like stillness that's doing a lot of work underneath. After the decision settled, fully, quietly, I entered a phase that felt almost monastic in its discipline. I didn't feel strategic. I felt clear. Clarity removes emotional noise. And without that noise, actions become surprisingly simple. I didn't change my expression. I didn't withdraw affection or suddenly become distant. I didn't hint. I didn't test. I didn't bait. From the outside, I was the same woman. That was essential, because the moment someone senses a shift before you're ready, they begin adjusting their behavior. They become careful. They edit themselves. And careful people leave fewer traces. I needed reality unfiltered, so I moved in silence. The first layer was administrative, unromantic, necessary. I reviewed every shared structure of our life the way an architect reviews load-bearing walls. Not with panic, methodically. Accounts, policies, documents, password recovery options. I noted what required both signatures and what didn't, what was joint, what was individual, what could be disentangled cleanly and what would require time. I didn't touch anything yet. Touching leaves fingerprints. Instead, I built a complete internal map. I knew exactly where I stood before I took a single step. The second layer was legal, not in action, but in understanding. I didn't file. I didn't consult loudly. I read, I learned, quietly, on my own time. I understood timelines, implications, thresholds, what silence protected, what it risked. what action too early could compromise. People assume legal strength begins with confrontation. It doesn't. It begins with comprehension. The third layer was emotional, but not in the way people expect. I didn't grieve yet. Grief clouds judgment when it's premature. I allowed myself something else instead. Detachment without denial. I acknowledged what was true without letting it dominate my inner landscape. I still laughed at dinner, still listened to him talk about his day, still asked questions, but I stopped investing. There's a difference between presence and attachment. I remained present. I quietly withdrew attachment. That withdrawal wasn't punishment. It was conservation. Energy is finite. I redirected mine inward, toward stability, toward readiness, toward a version of myself that didn't need reassurance from someone actively deceiving me. The most delicate part of moving in silence is resisting the urge to signal. No meaningful pauses, no loaded looks, no sudden independence that begs to be noticed. Silence works best when it's boring, and I became exquisitely boring. Predictable, calm, unreactive. He relaxed. That told me everything I needed to know. Because when someone is doing something wrong, what they fear most isn't confrontation, it's unpredictability. Once he believed nothing had changed, he stopped guarding the edges. That's when the final layer came into place. Positioning. I began shifting my life subtly, in ways that appeared natural, plausible, unremarkable. I reconnected with people I trusted, not to vent, not to reveal, but to reestablish independent gravity. I invested more attention into my work, not to escape, but to reinforce competence and autonomy. I made decisions that benefited me regardless of outcome. I didn't tell anyone why, because explanations create narratives. Narratives invite interference. This wasn't secrecy born of fear. It was privacy born of self-respect. Every move I made had one quiet requirement. If everything ended tomorrow, would I still be standing firmly on my own feet? If the answer was no, I adjusted. If the answer was yes, I proceeded. Days passed, then weeks. Nothing exploded, nothing demanded urgency, and that was the most powerful part. He thought time was on his side. He thought the absence of confrontation meant safety, that my calm meant acceptance, that my silence meant ignorance. People confuse peace with passivity all the time. What they don't realize is that peace, once chosen deliberately, becomes the most stable platform for irreversible action. I wasn't waiting for the right moment to speak. I was building a moment where speaking would be optional. By the time he noticed anything had changed, the structure underneath our life, the one I had always held quietly, would no longer be supporting him. And I wouldn't need to explain why. Consequences rarely announce themselves as punishment. More often, they arrive as absence. At first, nothing seemed different. That's what made it effective. Life continued on its surface rhythm: workdays, dinners, polite conversation, shared logistics. But underneath, the systems I had quietly stepped back from began to strain. He felt it before he understood it. Small inconveniences surfaced, not dramatic enough to complain about, but persistent enough to irritate. A bill that hadn't been automatically handled, a scheduling conflict that required his direct attention, a missed reminder that left him scrambling, slightly embarrassed, vaguely unsettled. He'd mentioned these things casually at first. Did we already take care of that? I thought this was handled. Didn't we talk about this? The word we carried a new uncertainty now. I answered honestly, calmly. No, I didn't. I wasn't aware of that. I thought you were taking care of it. No accusation, no defensiveness, just factual responses that returned responsibility to its rightful place. At first he assumed it was a phase, that I was tired, distracted, less on top of things than usual. He compensated clumsily, trying to juggle pieces he'd never realized were being managed for him. And that's when the real consequence began. Because dependency, once exposed, feels like loss. He didn't miss me. He missed the version of life that ran smoothly without his involvement. At work, the effects echoed quietly. I stopped absorbing overflow tasks without acknowledgement. I completed what was mine, precisely, professionally, but no longer buffered inefficiency. Meetings took longer. Decisions stalled. People noticed delays without immediately identifying the source. That's the thing about invisible labor. Once it's gone, everyone feels the drag. But no one knows what to name. A colleague asked if I was overwhelmed. Another suggested redistributing responsibilities. I listened. I agreed where it made sense. I didn't rush to fix the system. Letting people feel the weight of their assumptions is not cruelty. It's education. At home, his emotional state shifted before his behavior did. He grew restless, slightly irritable, not angry, confused. The ground beneath him no longer felt predictable, and he couldn't locate why. He asked if I was okay. I said yes, because I was. That answer unsettled him more than any complaint would have. He started paying closer attention, asking more questions, offering help in vague ways. Let me know if you need anything, without actually stepping into responsibility. I didn't guide him. Guidance would have recreated the old structure. Instead, I allowed him to experience uncertainty without rescue. The affair, I could tell, began to lose its sheen. Not because of guilt, because instability is unattractive when it seeps into every corner of your life. When the emotional anchor you assumed was immovable starts drifting, everything else feels less secure. I watched him oscillate between reassurance seeking and avoidance, between attentiveness and distraction, between trying to reconnect and retreating into whatever illusion of control he thought he still had. All the while, I remained steady, not cold, not withdrawn, just no longer compensating. That distinction mattered, because it meant no one could accuse me of neglect or cruelty. There was no dramatic shift to point to, no behavior to blame, only the slow realization that the ease he'd taken for granted was gone. And ease, once lost, is deeply felt. People around us began responding to him differently, too. Without my quiet mediation, his sharp edges became more visible, his forgetfulness less charming, his stress less contained. Nothing catastrophic, just cumulative. That's how consequences work when they're earned rather than imposed. He tried to talk about us one evening, vaguely, carefully, mentioned feeling off balance, wondered aloud if IVF stress had changed things between us. I listened. I didn't interrupt. Then I said, things change when responsibilities shift. That was all. No explanation, no reassurance, just a sentence that placed the weight back where it belonged. After that, the atmosphere changed. He became more anxious, not because he suspected the truth, but because he could sense loss without understanding its source. And ambiguity is far more frightening than certainty. He didn't know he was already experiencing the beginning of an ending. From my side, there was no satisfaction in watching this unfold. No quiet triumph, just confirmation. Confirmation that I had been carrying more than my share. Confirmation that my silence had been doing real work. Confirmation that when I stepped back, the imbalance revealed itself naturally. I wasn't dismantling his life. I was simply no longer holding it together for him. And once that support was gone, everything else began to recalibrate. Slowly, inevitably, without me lifting a finger. That's the truth about quiet dominance. You don't need to push. You just stop preventing the fall. By the time he realized something was wrong, he had already waited too long. That's the cruel symmetry of imbalance. The moment the person benefiting from it notices, the person carrying it has already moved on internally. His panic didn't arrive as drama. It arrived as overcorrection. Suddenly, he was attentive in ways that felt unfamiliar. He asked questions he'd never bothered with before. He referenced conversations from weeks earlier, trying to anchor himself back into a version of us that no longer existed. He offered help without knowing what help looked like. Tell me what you need. Just say the word. I feel like I've been missing something. Each sentence landed gently and far too late, because what he was missing wasn't information. It was timing. I watched him try to reinsert himself into systems he'd never learned to run. He stumbled over logistics. He misjudged priorities. He attempted emotional repair using language that sounded borrowed, like something he'd read rather than lived. And the most telling part? He still believed the issue was fixable through effort. Effort is persuasive early on. Late-stage clarity is not moved by it. The anxiety in him sharpened. I could feel it in the way he lingered at doorways, in how often he checked his phone while trying not to appear distracted, in the way he monitored my reactions for feedback I no longer offered. He asked more directly then, "Are we okay?" That question used to pull me into reassurance, into caretaking, into smoothing over discomfort before it solidified. This time it didn't. I answered truthfully, "I'm okay." He didn't know what to do with that, because what he was really asking was whether we were intact, whether the structure he relied on was still holding, whether the version of me who absorbed everything without consequence was still available. She wasn't, and I didn't announce her absence. I let him discover it in real time. He began revisiting the past aloud, reframing moments as misunderstandings, stress, external pressure, anything that implied circumstance rather than choice. I didn't argue. Arguing would have kept us in the same temporal space. I was already ahead. There's a point where regret becomes visible, not as remorse, but as fear. Fear of losing access, fear of being seen clearly, fear of consequences solidifying into permanence. That's where he was now. He tried transparency next, offered fragments of truth shaped carefully, admissions that stopped just short of accountability, confessions that centered his discomfort rather than my reality. I listened. Listening is powerful when you're no longer seeking reassurance. What struck me wasn't the betrayal. I already understood that. It was how much of his panic was about destabilization, not harm, about losing the life he'd assumed would continue running quietly beneath him. He wanted repair without reckoning, continuation without transformation. But some things cannot be repaired because they were never balanced to begin with. And the moment I stopped compensating, the imbalance became impossible to ignore. I felt no urge to punish him, no desire to humiliate or expose. The ending was already happening, whether he acknowledged it or not. Because the truth is this: once someone realizes you've been living without needing them, emotionally, structurally, internally, they understand something has shifted beyond recovery. You can't beg your way back into a position you never earned. You can't fix what depended on someone else's silence to survive. And you can't rush a repair when the other person has already crossed the point where repair was the goal. By the time he began trying to save us, I had already finished deciding who I would not be anymore. That's what made it too late. Not anger, not revenge, not even the affair. It was the moment I stopped needing him to understand in order to move forward. And once that happens, nothing can be reversed. The confrontation didn't happen the way people imagine these moments do. There was no shouting, no accusations thrown like weapons, no demand for explanations delivered through tears. By the time we finally spoke about it, really spoke, I no longer needed anything from him. And when need disappears, heat goes with it. It happened on an evening that was unremarkable by design. Dinner finished, dishes drying on the rack. The apartment quiet in that end-of-day way that leaves nowhere to hide from reality. He was already uneasy. I could see it in the way he hovered, in how he kept trying to start conversations that didn't go anywhere. He needed resolution, or absolution, or permission to believe this wasn't as serious as it felt. I didn't rush him. When I finally spoke, my voice surprised even me with its steadiness. I know. That was it. No preamble, no dramatic reveal. Just 2 words placed carefully between us. He froze. Not theatrically, but internally. You can tell when someone's mind is racing faster than their body can keep up. He asked what I meant, though we both knew that question was for time, not clarity. I know about her, I said, and I know why you hid her the way you did. I didn't raise my voice, I didn't list evidence, I didn't touch the phone. I didn't need to. His face told me everything. The collapse of rehearsed explanations, the scramble to regain footing, the instinctive reach for narrative control. He started talking quickly then. Context, stress, loneliness, confusion. He framed it as a deviation, a mistake, something external to who he really was. I let him finish. That silence, calm, unflinching, did more than any interruption could have. People reveal far more when they aren't fighting to be heard. When he finally stopped, he looked at me like he was waiting for impact, for anger, for pain, for proof that he still mattered enough to wound me. What he got instead was clarity. This isn't about her, I said, and it's not about forgiveness. That confused him, because he still thought this conversation was about repairing something. It's about the role I've been playing, I continued, and the one I'm done playing. I told him, without embellishment, without blame, what I had seen over time. How I had been relied on rather than partnered with. How my silence had become infrastructure. How the affair wasn't the fracture, but the exposure. He tried to interrupt. I raised my hand. Not sharply, just enough to signal completion. I'm not angry, I said, but I'm also not negotiating. That was the moment he understood. Not emotionally, structurally. There was nothing to argue against, no accusation to disprove, no tone to discredit. I wasn't presenting a case. I was stating a fact. I had already stepped out of the dynamic that allowed this to happen. He asked what I wanted. That question came too late. What I want isn't relevant anymore, I said. What I've chosen is. I told him my decision calmly. Not as an ultimatum, not as punishment, as information. The same way I'd always delivered important things clearly without drama. He tried one last time to reach for emotion. Apologies layered with fear, promises shaped by loss, a sudden willingness to change everything I'd asked for months, years without success. I listened, and then I said something that ended it. "I believe you mean it," I said, "and I still won't stay." That sentence carried no cruelty, only finality, because intention does not outweigh pattern. An effort, when offered only at the point of consequence, is not transformation, it's reaction. When the conversation ended, there was no explosion, just a quiet, irreversible understanding settling into the room. He sat there for a long time after I stood up. I didn't look back. Not because I was angry, but because there was nothing left to manage. That's what confrontation looks like when you've already done the hardest work alone. No heat, no chaos, just truth, delivered once. And once was enough. Who I am now didn't emerge from the ending. She emerged before it. The separation didn't create me. It revealed me. For a long time, I believed identity was shaped by proximity, by who you stood beside, what you held together, how well you absorbed the weight of shared life without complaint. I thought maturity meant learning to be smaller when necessary, quieter when it kept things stable. I was wrong. What I learned, slowly, deliberately, is that identity isn't forged through endurance. It's forged through alignment, through the quiet refusal to live in contradiction with yourself. After everything ended, people expected a transformation that looked dramatic. A new voice, a sharper edge, anger, reinvention as performance. That never came. What came instead was steadiness without strain. My days became simpler, not because life was easier, but because it was mine. I no longer woke up scanning the emotional environment for cues. I no longer adjusted my tone to prevent someone else's discomfort. Decisions no longer required translation or permission. I noticed the difference most in my body. My shoulders dropped, my breath slowed. Silence no longer felt like something I had to fill. I wasn't bracing anymore. There was grief, yes, but it was clean. It didn't tangle itself with self-doubt or bargaining. I mourned what I had hoped for, not what I had lost. That distinction mattered. Hope can be honored without being preserved. What surprised me most was how little bitterness followed me forward. I had expected at least some residue, resentment, anger, a sharpness that needed expression. Instead, I felt something closer to respect, not for what happened, but for how I handled it. I respected the woman who noticed quietly instead of exploding, the woman who prepared without deception, the woman who chose clarity over confrontation when confrontation would have fed the wrong story. That respect became a foundation. From it, I rebuilt relationships differently. I spoke earlier, not louder, just sooner. I paid attention to reciprocity without keeping score. I stopped rewarding people for misunderstanding me, and when something didn't feel right, I trusted that feeling without needing external confirmation. That trust changed everything. Work became a place where I took up appropriate space, not by demanding it, but by no longer shrinking preemptively. I accepted recognition when it came. I declined responsibility that wasn't matched with authority. Calm didn't disappear, but it stopped being an invitation for extraction. In intimacy, I learned to distinguish between being needed and being chosen. I no longer confuse reliability with love or silence with safety. I let myself be seen, not all at once, not recklessly, but honestly. And I learned something else too. Quiet doesn't mean invisible. It means intentional. There is a version of strength that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't posture or perform or dominate the room. It simply refuses to abandon itself again. That's who I am now. Not louder, not harder, not colder. Just aligned. I don't tell this story as a warning or a lesson wrapped in righteousness. I tell it because many people mistake their restraint for weakness and their patience for obligation. I know now that my restraint was always power. My patience was always choice. And the moment I reclaimed that choice, my life stopped requiring endurance to maintain it. That's not triumph. That's integrity. When people ask how I feel now, they usually expect a clean emotion. Relief, strength, closure, something easily summarized. The truth is more layered than that, and more peaceful. I don't feel victorious. I don't feel broken. I don't feel like I won. What I feel is settled. This story isn't about infidelity in the way people usually tell it. Affairs are loud on the surface, but often secondary underneath. What happened between my husband and that woman mattered, but not as much as what had been happening between me and myself long before I knew her name. The real betrayal wasn't the secrecy. It was the assumption that my silence meant consent, that my steadiness meant permanence, that my patience meant I would always stay. That assumption is where many relationships quietly fail, not through cruelty, but through neglect wrapped in comfort. I don't hate him. I don't even resent him. Resentment requires ongoing engagement, and I no longer live there. I understand now that people don't suddenly take advantage. They gradually accept what is freely given without question. And I gave too much of myself away by staying quiet when clarity was needed. That doesn't make me naive. It makes me human. The difference is that now I listen when my inner voice lowers instead of raises, when something inside me becomes still rather than reactive. That stillness has never lied to me. Quiet dominance isn't about control over others. It's about self-possession. It's knowing that you don't need to explain every decision for it to be valid, that you don't need to erupt to be taken seriously. That walking away calmly can be more definitive than any confrontation. I didn't expose him publicly. I didn't punish him. I didn't rewrite the past to make myself look flawless. I simply stopped participating in a reality that required my self-erasure to continue. And that was enough. If there's a moral here, it's not leave at the first sign of disrespect, or never trust, or be colder next time. It's this. Pay attention to how often your calm is used as a resource instead of respected as a choice. Because the moment you stop choosing it, everything becomes very clear, very quickly. Before I end this, I want to ask you something, not as a prompt, but as a genuine question you can sit with. Have you ever been quiet in a relationship, not because you had nothing to say, but because you learned that saying it wouldn't change anything? If so, I'd really like to hear your thoughts in the comments. Thank you for listening.
Video hữu ích, hãy ấn like và đăng ký kênh để ủng hộ mình nhé. Chúng ta sẽ gặp nhau ở những video tiếp theo. Bye bye.